will face in his talk about biometrics, privacy, and remote authentication, and its relation with the consumer electronics. Dr. Jim Wayman is currently an IEEE Distinguished Lecturer in the area of automated human recognition, biometrics, and works as a research administrator in the Office of Graduate Studies, and research at San Jose University, and he received the PhD degree in engineering in 1980 from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He has worked continuously in the field of biometrics since 1984, and he was a member of the U.S. National Academies of Science National Research Council, NRC, with their biometrics and authentication technologies and their implications for privacy. He has served for 4 years to the NRC Panel of Information Technology, and he's a fellow of the IEEE and IET. He has served as a paid advisor on biometrics to 11 national governments worldwide. So, Jim, thank you for being here. It's our pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you all very much. I want to start by playing just a funny video that perhaps you have not seen. Let me see if I can find the video here. Let's see if we have sound.
Mr. President, we have a situation.
Once again, a UFO has landed in America. The only country UFOs ever seem to land in.
Well, I wanted to show you that video that expresses the fears some people have about technologies aimed at recognizing individuals. I mean, will it really get to that point? I was quite pleased to find that in this current issue of Consumer Electronics, if you go to page 62, there's an article very nicely written called Biometric Systems in the Czech Republic. This article is not actually about biometric systems in the Czech Republic, but is about the attitudes of people living in the Czech Republic to biometric systems. And if you turn here to page 65, you will find that their attitudes are mixed and varied. For instance, it says here, do you mind being identified without your permission? 81 said, yes, they mind, meaning they don't like it. Do you think this information can be misappropriated? 91% said yes. And then they were asked, will biometrics bring you some advantages? And 72% said yes. So there seems to be a mixture of attitudes towards biometrics when people are asked the question, how do you feel about them? Now, we in the IEEE, I think, have a responsibility to help lead public perception. That is, it's not enough for us to ask people, how do you feel? I think we should develop a framework for discussing these issues in greater depth. So my goal in the talk today is to develop a framework for discussing biometrics, privacy, and remote authentication. And I want to go through each one of those terms carefully. Much of my work in the last 12 years has centered around the development of information technology terminology with the International Organization of Standards, ISO. I've served on at least 2 different committees for terminology development, and this quotation up here is from an ISO standard on terminology work. And I want to read this to you because it's so important, particularly for the meeting that we have here today. The standard said concepts and terms develop differently in individual language and language communities, depending on social, economic, cultural, and linguistic factors. Not only do terms develop differently in different language communities, they develop differently in different technical communities. So I am from a background of one-dimensional signal processing, and we use terms quite differently than the two-dimensional signal processing people use the terms. Signal processing people working in 2 dimensions often use the generic term image, whereas they mean signal, or at least in the vocabulary of the one-dimensional signal processing community, we would use the term signal, never the term image. So many of our definitions vary not only across language communities, but across technical communities as well. And so also in this ISO standard, it says differences between parallel concept systems on one hand and misleading similarities at the term level on the other cause problems for international communication. So it may be that when we discuss issues like biometrics, privacy, and remote authentication, it may sound like we are expressing 2 different opinions, whereas really we're expressing a difference in our understanding of the definition of the terms. I'm going to present some definition of the terms, not to say that these definitions must be authoritative, but only to say when I discuss biometrics, privacy, and remote authentication, this is the meaning I give those terms. The first term, which is quite controversial in fact, is the term biometrics. I can't discuss this term in any language other than English. You may use words like biometry in your language. I can't tell you the history of those terms, but I certainly can tell you the history of the term biometrics in the English language. It was used apparently the first time by William Whewell in 1831 when discussing Malthusian population growth. William Whewell, you may remember, is famous in the English language for being the first to use the word scientist. Prior to William Whewell, a person working in science was called a man of science, and William Whewell was asked to write a letter of commendation to a woman who'd been working in science. And rather than call her a man of science, he coined the term scientist. And when he used the term biometrics, he was referring to computations in Malthusian growth levels. Specifically, he used it in the context of trying to determine how population growth will change if people in developing countries put off marriage to a later date. By the latter part of the 19th century, the term had come to mean the study of the length of life. I recently, last week, went on to several different online dictionaries and found that one online dictionary still gave this as one definition of biometrics. That is the study of the length of life. Sometimes we use the term actuarial tables to mean that. Francis Galton, Sir Francis Galton, was the nephew of Charles Darwin, and he is, to the entire biometrics community, regardless of how we define the term, considered to be our grandfather. He founded a British publication called Biometrica, and in 1901 wrote an editorial in Biometrica defining biometrics as the application to biology of the modern methods of statistics. Now, Ronald Fisher came along and founded a second journal, again in the UK, again on biometrics, this journal called Biometrics, and both of these journals, incidentally, Biometrica and Biometrics, survive to this day. And Ronald Fisher defined biometrics as the active pursuit of biological knowledge by quantitative methods. If you look at a modern dictionary, for instance, the Oxford Dictionary, they give a very similar definition to biometrics. My particular Oxford English Dictionary says the application of statistical methods to biological data. But recently, about 3 years ago, has been developed yet a third journal on biometrics, again a British journal. This is called the IET Biometrics. IET is the British equivalent of the IEEE. It's the Institute of Engineering and Technology. And in this journal, the following definition is given: the automated recognition of individuals based on their biological and behavioral characteristics. This definition is part of a new international standard in vocabulary for biometrics called ISO IEC 2382, Part 37. That vocabulary, which contains 121 terms, is available online for free, and here's where you need to go to get it. What I use the term here in this talk, I'm going to be using the sixth definition up there, the automated recognition of individuals based on their biological and behavioral characteristics. But clearly there are aspects, there are portions of the biological community who are very unhappy at me and my community in security and computer security for using the term biometrics in this very, very narrow fashion. And if you go to almost any university in the world that has a biology department, you will find within the biology department someone who refers to herself or himself as a biometrician, and they will be using the definition more similar to 3, 4, or 5 up there. So when I use biometrics, I'm talking about the automated recognition of individuals based on biological and behavioral characteristics. And this definition has some strong implications. I was on the committee that put together that definition. We debated for a couple of years that definition. Every word is important. Every word was carefully chosen. We chose recognition and not authentication, authorization, verification, or identification. If you go to some older definitions of biometrics in the sense of computer security, you'll find that older definitions include concepts of verification or identification. We don't include that in the ISO definition of biometrics. Those are applications of the fundamental technology, but what the fundamental technology does is use computers to recognize people. Now, if you want to put that into a system that verifies some claim, if you want to put that into a system that identifies someone, you can do that. But what all the technology can do is to recognize you, and I really like the Latin languages better than English or German on this. Recognize, recognoscere, to know again. An automated system can know you again, meaning if it's seen you before, it can say, yes, yes, I've seen that person before. But that system cannot solve the riddle of identity. There is in the modern philosophical community great debate over what constitutes human identity. Who am I as a person? In biometrics, we recognize individuals by recognizing their body. So we're using fingerprints, we're using faces, we're using iris images, we're using hand shape, we're using voice patterns. We are recognizing people by recognizing their bodies, and this puts us on one particular side of the philosophical camp involving what is human identity. It puts us on the side of the animalists that say a human being is a body. Now, there's another point of view entirely in the philosophical community, and those are the psychological theorists who say, no, 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 a human is much more than just a body. A human is something far greater that uses the body, and there's a very famous Sidney Schumacher, I believe, suggested this experiment, the mind transplant experiment. If my mind is transplanted into your body and your mind is transplanted into my body, then who am I? Am I in that body? Am I in this body? This is one of the great riddles of human identity, and people have written books on both sides trying to prove their point. But in the work that we do, we say simply, we've solved that problem for all of you, and we're going to call an individual a body. Well, that's interesting that we should say that we are going to do that, and that certainly raises some problems. I want to turn now to the concept of privacy. What do we mean when we say privacy? A very famous writer in the United States is Daniel Solove. He's written many popular books on privacy, and this particular article in the University of Pennsylvania Law Review. He says, the term privacy is a concept in disarray. Nobody can articulate what it means. And this is one of the experts on privacy in the United States saying that we really don't know what the term means. I think one thing we can all agree on, however, is that privacy itself is culturally conditioned and heavily dependent upon local legal structures. When we were debating different words for biometrics within the ISO community, we had a Russian physician on our committee, and he told us that in Russian there is no word for privacy. Now you might say, well, gee, that's awfully backwards of the Russians. They don't recognize the concept of privacy. Maybe actually the Russian language is more advanced than in English. And maybe the Russians are simply telling us that there is no single concept for which a single word can be assigned, and that we have conflated or confounded many, many different concepts when we use in English the word privacy. So it may be that the Russians really know something that we haven't well understood in English, and that is that the word we use, privacy, stands for many, many, many different types of concepts. I like very much a chapter in Volume 5 of the History of the Private Life. This is a very interesting series of 5 volumes of French, written originally in French, and really concentrating on the history of private life or privacy in France. It's a very, very well-known series of books. Volume 5 is the one that speaks most clearly to me. I think it's called The Modern Concepts of Privacy. And the very first chapter of that book has some quantitative methods that I thought were interesting. One of the problems with privacy is it's hard to put a number on it. It's hard to come up with anything quantitative that we can put our finger on. In this particular chapter, they came up with different measures. For instance, the average number of bedrooms per person, the percentage of the population that lived at their work site. I thought this was very interesting in terms of trying to find a quantitative measure to express the expansion of privacy over time. Well, in the United States, at least, in academia, we talk about at least 2 types of privacy. We talk about intrinsic privacy, quoting a very famous article from the Harvard Law Review from 1890. You know, I often make this quote in papers that I submit for publication, and several times people have circled that and said, oh, don't you mean 1980? No, I mean 1890. The right to be let alone. And editors don't like that either. The more modern way to say that, in American at least, would be the right to be left alone. But in this 1890 paper by 2 very famous journalists, incidentally, there's a Brandeis University in New York named after Louis Brandeis. Samuel Warren is equally famous. They use the term the right to be let alone. We now call that intrinsic privacy. The idea is, please don't touch my body or come too close to my physical space. I need you not to be physically close to me. I need you not to be inspecting me. That's what we refer to as intrinsic privacy. We add to that informational privacy, best articulated in a book by Alan Weston, Privacy and Democracy. Old book, 1967, but Alan Weston is about to publish a brand new book called Privacy and Freedom. I can hardly wait to get that book, but it won't be released until November. What is that, 47 years after his original publication. And he made the following definition of informational privacy: the claim of individuals, groups, or institutions to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. We call this informational privacy. I'm going to offer here in a minute that perhaps Alan Weston was a bit too ambitious with this definition. I like the word aspirational, but I mean by that is it may be our aspiration to have this, but in practice, I don't think it's realistic or possible. But nonetheless, biometrics, as I've defined it previously here, can impact both intrinsic privacy and informational privacy, and that's what I want to explore a little bit. There is an American word, creepy. Now, in your language, you probably have this word. It's a slang word that only recently has come into the academic lexicon. Creepy is something that makes me feel strange. Creepy is something that is not right. And so there's a very nice article that's been written here in the Yale Journal of Law and Technology just last year, A Theory of Creepy, Technology, Privacy, and Shifting Norms. My wife considers biometrics to be creepy. She doesn't like it. Why? Well, first of all, going back to our definition of biometrics, we are going to recognize individuals by inspecting bodies. I've said recognize me by inspecting my body because I want to make this personal. This is personal. I'm going to recognize you by looking very carefully at your fingerprints or your eye or your face or the back of your hand or your finger. That feels a little strange. I'm going to look very carefully, very closely at your body to recognize you. And therefore, I've defined you as your body. Remember, this is animalism in the philosophical debate on what constitutes an individual. We have made that decision. We say we don't care about the philosophical debate, and it's a very serious one, I might add. We have simply decided that you will be your body. Now, this is quite different from pins and passwords. If I recognize you through the use of a PIN or a password, I'm certainly engaging your person. You may be using your body to express to me what the PIN and the password is. You may use your body to write the PIN and the password, or you may use your body to say the PIN and the password, but it's your person that's expressing that identifier. It's not your body that's being inspected. So I think that people respond differently, reasonably, rightfully, to biometrics than they do pins and passwords, simply because of the intrusive nature of close bodily inspection that feels creepy. And so many people will say, well, biometrics invades my privacy, when what they really mean is, I don't like being inspected. This is impacting my intrinsic concepts of coming close to my space, of looking at my body. The video that I showed you at the start of this talk showed many different forms of violation, I think, of intrinsic privacy. And I would highly recommend this paper. It's quite interesting, from the Yale Journal of Law and Technology. Now, biometrics is not new. That is, automated recognition of people is not new. We can trace some of the earliest work of automated recognition to the 1940s and the use of analog computers, but certainly by 1960 and the beginning of the availability of digital computers to large groups, particularly Bell Research Laboratory. Some of the first problems that were taken on by these digital computers were trying to recognize people. The first paper published on automated recognition of fingerprints was published in 1963 by Mitchell Trowering in Nature. By 1965, work was going on the automated recognition of signatures. That paper, incidentally, is interesting because the fast Fourier transform had not yet been developed. And so to come up with the narrowband spectral components, it was necessary to use analog filters and to put analog sensors on the pen. By 1969, people were experimenting with hand geometry. By hand geometry, I mean the shadow of the hand. People were discussing their use in banking systems by 1969 and actually deploying them in banking transactions by 1974. So by the 1970s, people were quite concerned with the impact of these technologies on privacy. It's interesting, in the 70s, these technologies were not referred to as biometrics. They were referred to as automated personal identification technologies. The term biometrics was not appropriated to these technologies until 1980. And so at an IEEE meeting at Stanford University 5 or 6 years ago, we honored Dr. James Young of the IEEE for his early contributions to the field. Unfortunately, David Raphael has passed away, but James Young, who worked at Stanford Research Institute, is now in his late 70s. He's very much alive and well, and came and shared with us at an IEEE meeting in which we gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award. He wrote this about the impact of biometrics on privacy in the 1970s. Many of these people will voice a fear that biometric systems will contribute to the massive cross-indexing capability, the capability of gathering more and more facts from previously prepared but separate files, including their movements from place to place, purchases, financial transactions, and other activities heretofore considered personal and private. In other words, Dr. Young was expressing the impact on informational privacy as defined by Alan Weston of these biometric measures. So more specifically, if I give my bank my fingerprint and I give my church my fingerprint, there is a possibility that my bank and my church can compare records in a way that I don't want them compared. Now, that's a rather odd example, give my church my fingerprint. It happened to me. When my children were young, we took turns babysitting the children in Sunday school, the small children, during church service. And one Sunday a month, it would be my turn to babysit the children, and then the other 3 Sundays a month I could go to church on my own. And one day I came to church and they had a fingerprinting system set up. Well, this is very strange. Fingerprinting in church? I said to the pastor, this is very, very strange. He said, we have to do it. We have to express due diligence that we are trying to keep sexual offenders out of our Sunday school classrooms. We will be sending these fingerprints to the state to run against their sexual offenders database, and I understood this. There is a legal liability for the church. If anything would happen, they had to show that they did due diligence to stop this from happening. So now I've given my fingerprints to the church. I've given my fingerprints to border crossing agencies. When I came into Germany on Sunday, some people on some types of visas were giving their fingerprints at border crossing. I was not asked to do that. But just as James Young warned, this would lead to a massive cross-indexing capability. Perhaps the ability to match my church giving records against my border crossing records. I'm suddenly losing control of all of this information because they can be cross-indexed by a common identifier, namely my fingerprints. And all of this, of course, was written before the era of cell phones and the extensive adoption of credit cards. One of the points I also want to make is that cell phones and credit cards probably represent a much greater threat to biometrics and the combining of data than do to privacy and the combining of data than do biometrics. Cell phones, as you know, can be used to track me. Credit cards can also track me, maybe not in as frequent intervals, but I've used my credit card almost every day I've been here in Germany, and certainly the credit card company is well aware that I'm now in Germany, and they also know how much money I'm spending, and they know where I'm spending that money. Biometrics can't do any of those things. All right. So how are we going to get a grip on privacy if privacy is culturally determined, if everyone has a different idea of what it might mean, and if it's a concept in disarray? One thing we can do is look at what the law says. Now, I want to be a little bit apologetic here. I want to talk about U.S. law, and I want to explain about why I'm talking about U.S. law in Germany. First of all, I know very little about German or EU law, so I don't want to make any statements about that. And secondly, I want to be critical of the law, and I don't believe as an American it's seemly, it's appropriate for me to come to Germany and criticize EU law on biometrics and privacy, but I don't feel any discomfort in criticizing U.S. law. In fact, I think maybe as an academic, it's my responsibility to take a critical look at what the U.S. law is. Now, there are other people, and I'll quote them here in a minute, who've taken a look at the impact of German laws on privacy and biometrics, and I have a good paper here on the next slide I'll show you. So in U.S. constitutional law, there is no mention of privacy. There is a Fourth Amendment to the Constitution which says the right of the people to be secure in their persons. And the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted that to mean the right of a man, you note the word man, it was a 1961 ruling, the right of a man to retreat into his own home and there be free from unreasonable government intrusion. So the courts have said that our Fourth Amendment to the Constitution give us the right to retreat into our own home. And the courts have gone on in later years to expand on the concept of privacy, even though there's no mention of the word privacy itself in our Constitution. In a very famous decision in 1967 called Katz versus the United States, they said you're entitled to privacy if you have a reasonable expectation of it. So the Supreme Court would argue that right now I have no reasonable expectation of any privacy whatsoever, right? But if I were to go downstairs to the restroom, for instance, I would have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So there are cameras now that are aimed at me and are recording my every word. I was told that that would happen. I didn't need to be told that. I had no reasonable expectation of privacy when I stood up in front of you to speak. I hope when I go down to the bathroom at the end of this talk, there will not be cameras down there because I have a reasonable expectation in the bathroom that that will not be happening. Now, there was a very unusual ruling in 2001 that has the legal community in the United States somewhat upset. The Supreme Court decided there would be greater protection from newer technologies not in general public use to assure preservation of that degree of privacy against government that existed when the Fourth Amendment was adopted. And it said we cannot be left at the mercy of advancing technology. Let me tell you specifically the details of this case. Mr. Chiolo was growing marijuana in the attic of his house, and he was putting out infrared radiation, as you can imagine. The police came along and saw this incredible amount of infrared radiation coming out of his house. They said he must be growing marijuana in there. They went into the house, found marijuana growing, and arrested him. He said this was an unreasonable violation of my privacy, and the court agreed, saying that he could not have known about this IR technology. So he had a reasonable expectation of privacy because he did not know such technology existed. Now, this is very odd. It means that if you don't know anything about biometric technology, you have greater protection against the use of that technology than someone who does know about it. Meaning, as we become more and more familiar with biometric technology, the courts in the United States seem to be saying that we have less and less protection against it. That's very, very odd. A lot of people don't like that decision, but that's currently the state of case law in the United States. Now, there are some additional concepts of privacy here in the EU. I don't want to speak about them because I'm not an expert, but you know about this right to be forgotten, right? My understanding is that the 2012 European Data Protection Act, Data Protection Regulation, Article 17, is not currently adopted, but is pending adoption this year that will establish within the European Union a right to be forgotten. So what is the implication for the right to be forgotten of biometrics? Well, suppose that my biometric measures, such as my fingerprint, are fairly stable. Suppose you can recognize me now against fingerprints that were taken, say, when I went to college in the 1960s. I certainly wish much of what I did in college would be forgotten. But if my fingerprint is attached to information then and information now, perhaps my right to be forgotten will be impeded by the application of biometric technology. A very nice article circulating now in the U.S., this Data Retention in the Panoptic Society, the Social Benefits of Forgetfulness, is a U.S. article that really confirms to me the wisdom of the concept of the right to be forgotten. But you know how hard that has been for Google, right? You've heard all of these, because a piece of information about me generally involves other people. And secondly, excuse me, what is the right of anyone to demand historical revisionism? I mean, the truth of the matter is, in college, I did do those things. That's absolutely true. Do I have the right to revise the record 50 years later? I don't know whether I do or not. There are specific prohibitions about data accumulation in both the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU and the Council of European Convention 108 that extend beyond anything we've done in the United States. The data protection laws here in Europe are much stronger than in the US. My good friend Astrid Albrecht, who now goes by the name Astrid Schumacher, works for BSE, you would say in German. The German translation is the German Federal Office of Information Security. Astrid was a lawyer, and she went back to school to get a PhD in biometrics, and her PhD thesis, which was published in 2003, you can probably translate it better than I can. It's something about the points of controversy in biometric methods used for electronic verification and personal privacy. Maybe you have a better translation than I do for that. Astrid's thesis is available online. She talks about, incidentally, my understanding is there are 16 states here in Germany, I believe 16 states. There is a difference in privacy law relating to biometrics in each of the 16 German states. So it's very, very difficult, even within Germany, let alone within the European Union, to make any strong statements about what the legal status of biometrics and privacy is. Now, the National Academies of Science has looked into this whole issue in at least a couple of different papers. I want to supply a couple of slides here directly out of one of their papers. This paper, Who Goes There? Authentication Systems Through the Lens of Privacy. It was published in 2003. I was on that committee, and I want to talk about the definitions given the words authentication. Now, remember, the title of this talk is Biometrics, Privacy, and Remote Authentication. Each one of these terms is not exactly clear to us, and I want to talk about how the term authentication was defined by the National Academies of Science. Authentication is the process of establishing confidence in the truth of some claim. So individual authentication is the process of establishing that an identifier refers to a specific individual. Identity authentication is the process of establishing that an identifier refers to an identity. So now, what is an identity? According to this report of the National Academy of Science, identity is the set of information about an individual associated with that individual in a particular identity system Y. This is a very problematic definition of identity. It means that every one of you hold a different identity for me. Every one of you hold a different set of attributes for me. And the attributes that you hold for me may be very different from the attributes I hold for me. And this gets back to my problem with Alan Weston's concept of informational privacy. If you hold certain attributes about me, why should you not share those attributes with whoever you wish to share them? So someone says next year to you, I'm going to a conference, Jim Wayman is speaking, you heard him speak before, is it worth going to the conference? I think you have every right to tell that person your impression, what I spoke about, whether you found me boring, whether you found me wearing a crazy shirt. That may be my identity, but it's my identity record is held by you. And so you're very, very involved with that. And can I make you forget the identity record you hold on me? And what if you lent me money? What if I find, and I suppose this has happened to all of us at some time, has it not? We go to international conferences and we get in line for the lunch and we reach into our pocket and find we're all out of the local currency. That certainly happened to me. And I've certainly had to turn to colleagues and say, you know, can you lend me 10 euros? I'm embarrassed, but I'm all out of euros at the moment. So if you lend me money, do you have the right to tell other people, well, I lent him money and he didn't pay me back? And if you have that right, do the lending institutions have the right of sharing that data? So I may feel as though informational privacy means my right to control who has what information about me, but the truth is it's your information that you have about me, and you have a right to share it, and you have a right not to forget it. So the concept of informational privacy may be a bit too aspirational, as I said. Authorization, as defined by the National Academy of Science, is the process of deciding what an individual ought to be allowed to do. So here are some slides directly from the report of the National Academies of Science regarding biometrics and privacy. They said, in general, people maintain multiple identities. Authorization does not always require authentication. Authorization does not always necessitate accountability, and the use of a small number of identifiers across systems facilitate linkage that can undermine privacy. So now we're getting to some interesting points about biometrics, privacy, and remote authentication. The National Academy said specifically to avoid remote enrollment or re-enrollment. I'll show you on the next slide why that would be. Biometrics linked to a name or other identifying information can reveal your identity. Biometrics cannot be reissued if stolen or sold. Exception handling is always needed. User control of biometric templates is the most privacy sensitive, and currently biometrics is not useful for tracking people. So if anyone asks you to remotely enroll in a biometric system, I suggest the following are options. There are many, many fingerprints, for example, out on the internet. The two fingerprints here are from databases that are widely distributed. There are a number of books that come with CDs of fingerprints in the back. By fingerprints on a number of those CDs. If someone wants you to enroll a biometric measure remotely, why don't you enroll somebody else's fingerprint? Right, it will be just as effective. Here is a picture of a piece of cardboard in which I drew a fingerprint, and I enrolled that piece of cardboard on the fingerprint system I have at home. On the internet, no one knows you're a piece of cardboard, right? So one thing you can do is you can enroll someone else's biometrics, you can enroll something other than a real fingerprint in the system if required to do them remotely. Now, I say here to calm the fears of some of my people in the industry, yes, you may have to choose your substrate carefully, but in the case of the fingerprint scanner, and the one I have at home is a very modern scanner, it's a brand new scanner, this piece of cardboard with a fingerprint drawn on it worked just fine. But there are local enrollment solutions, and I want to refer now specifically to the Apple iPhone 5. I see no problem here at all, because the fingerprint never leaves the iPhone. This is found on the Apple site here. Your fingerprint data is never accessed by the operating system or other apps. It is never stored on Apple servers, never backed up in the iCloud or anywhere else. Only Touch ID uses it, and it can't be matched against other fingerprint databases. I would suggest to you that my Apple phone is older. I don't have the fingerprint scanner. But I find no implications for privacy whatsoever in allowing my cell phone to have my fingerprint. You probably heard here the news last week. Some celebrity photos were hacked. They were hacked through some social engineering processes. You know, if you lose your password to your email account, there are some security questions you can ask. And the way the press reported this, one actress had a dog whose name was Tinkerbell, and that had been well reported in the press. And the person that hacked into the database went through the "I have forgotten my password" and answered the security question, "What is the name of your dog?" appropriately, and was able to change the password and therefore get in and hack the account. Now, I see if you can overcome that through a fingerprint which is stored on an iPhone and truly does not leave the iPhone, I find some actually privacy-enhancing possibilities for the use of biometrics in a very localized and controlled application. But I want to say something quickly about biometrics and security. Someone will raise their hand and say, yes, but didn't the Chaos Club break the iPhone fingerprint system the first day it was released? And of course it did. We all knew that would happen. nice article here in the Journal of Forensic Science that traces the spoofing of fingerprint systems back to 1907. Clearly those systems were not automated, but the spoofing of biometric systems has been well known for as long as there have been biometric systems. By the 1970s, people were quite concerned with this. There were papers done on spoofing of hand geometry systems, spoofing of voice systems, and as I said, this article here will point out that the spoofing of fingerprint systems started a whole century ago. Popular reports tend to exaggerate this problem. When the Chaos Club spoofed the iPhone, they had the cooperation of the person that was being spoofed. It is not easy to get an image of the right fingerprint that I've been using. You don't know what finger I use on this, if this had a fingerprint scanner on it. It would be very hard for you to get a nice, clear image of the correct finger without my cooperation. It would require not only that you had my phone, but that you had very clean copies of fingerprints. This is harder to do than the press makes it out to be. I think this is a problem that's been over-exaggerated. There are some additional problems, however, that if you were to use biometrics and they were to ask for your right thumbprint, for instance, in the state of California, everyone getting a driver's license must give a right thumbprint, then you'd be using the same identifier for multiple sites. Loss of that right thumbprint would compromise every site that uses the right thumbprint as a identifier. Multiple protection schemes have been offered by the technical community, for instance, cancelable biometrics, biometric vaults, fuzzy vaults. These are well available in the literature. Perhaps you've had papers here at ICCE conferences on that, but they're not instantiated. No one's using them. We talk about them a lot at technical conferences. Nobody uses these things yet. And on the other hand, fingerprints can be lost, they can be forgotten, they can be stolen. I want to go back to slides. You see these two pictures here on the left? That's the same finger. That's the same finger imaged at a period of 6 weeks. I was responsible for that data collection effort. Right? Fingerprints change quite a lot over a period of even 6 weeks. They can change on a daily basis. So if your fingerprint changes and you can't be recognized, there has to be a backup method for replacing that fingerprint or changing the fingerprint. And now we're in the same situation that we were in with the actress whose account was hacked because she had some security questions. So the question I ask is, if biometrics are used, what is the backup system when the biometrics fail? And biometrics do indeed fail because every part of the human body is subject to change through normal wear and tear or through traumatic injury. All right, I'm going to finish up here with the next couple of slides. In the United States, we have national identification numbers. They're called Social Security numbers. The government tells us we should take very good care of these numbers. And here are some guidelines from a Social Security Administration publication that said you should be careful about sharing your number with anyone who asks for it. Don't make it easy for someone to steal your number, and identity thieves get your personal information by stealing information you provide to an unsecure site on the internet. I think that fingerprints should be protected at least with as much effort as we protect our national ID numbers. That this information that the U.S. government gives people about use of their national ID numbers should be applied equally to fingerprints as well. So I'm going to conclude with the following slide. I call this Guidelines for Privacy-Preserving Use of Biometrics for Remote Authentication. That, again, was pretty much implied by the title of this talk, Biometrics, Privacy, and Remote Authentication. The threat to biometrics to privacy is less than that of other common technologies, such as cell phones and credit cards. But biometrics has a creepy element that those methods don't have. Biometrics are well suited for local recognition on user-controlled devices, but like all security methods, they can be defeated by determined hackers. Most requirements for remote authentication are for authorization, not identification. Does not need close bodily exam. If someone wants you to be bodily examined for an authorization of a transaction, I would ask, why is that necessary? Aren't there other ways we can do this? Biometric identifiers cannot be replaced if lost, stolen, or sold. The long-term biometric stability of biometric identifiers may inhibit your right to be forgotten. And although protection schemes such as spoof detection and cancelable biometrics are under development, they are not used in practice. And lastly, biometric identifiers should be protected at least as carefully as your national ID numbers. Well, I acknowledge that I've run a little bit over in my time. Thank you for your indulgence, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Any question?
Joe. So that's an interesting technology. It's a thermal technology that takes advantage of the fact that your ridges and your valleys have slightly different temperature. That's what you would call generally security through obscurity. And so it's all proprietary. The internal operations is all quite proprietary. It turns out I've been contacted by a labor union, and there's going to be a case next month where I'm asked to testify where the security method is exactly that. It's a proprietary method. Nobody really knows how anything is being stored within the system. And so the question is, does that represent a secure instantiation? So to answer your question directly, we don't know. There are standards for fingerprints, but there's no reason for that system to store according to any standard at all. So since we don't know, it's security through obscurity.
More questions?
Yes, sir. Professor Little. Now he's going to come to the microphone. We're not going to ask you to sing while you're there, sir.
No, my question is a little bit of a trick question because I know you're often called on in legal matters to give your opinion, and you're being recorded. But I'm wondering, since the Constitution doesn't actually use the word privacy, as these biometrics get tied to more things like Google that have economic benefits, do you think the government might ever bow to that and just say, well, since it doesn't say privacy, there really isn't any, and we're going to let anybody do what they want to do?
So in the United States, there are only two privacy acts that make any sense at all. One is the Privacy Act of 1974 that's never really been enforced and makes very little reference to data privacy. And there's also a Computer Matching Act of 1989. Those are the most recent acts we have. Now, there are groups within Washington, D.C. that want to have a new U.S. Privacy Act, but everyone is frightened. The government is frightened because they feel the Privacy Act might be too loose. And the privacy advocates are threatened because they feel that a new Privacy Act may be written in favor of the government because, after all, it would be written by Congress and signed by the President. So right now in Washington, we're at an impasse. We know there needs to be a new Privacy Act, but everyone on both sides is afraid of what that new Privacy Act may entail. Right now, certainly if you're not a U.S. citizen, you have no rights to privacy at all. So when you come to the United States and use the U.S. visit system, the United States government will maintain that data for 75 years. And they can share it within the United States government or even with other governments any way they see fit. You're not entitled as a non-U.S. citizen to any privacy protection whatsoever. So I know a number of people, a number of European citizens that will no longer go to the United States for precisely that reason. It's not crazy to say that since your fingerprints are offered no protection in the U.S., you simply won't go. I'm not advocating that you take that approach, but I'm saying that I know people that take that approach.